check, first of all, could a few of you just give me a thumbs up into your screen just so that I know you can see the screen that we're sharing? So you should be able to see the text on the screen. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so now I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight's lecture, Mr. Joe Falvey. So Joe is a retired secondary school teacher who taught in Newtown School. Joe will celebrate 50 years of life in Waterford, I believe, next year. As a local historian, his interest was very much inspired by Danny's book, Waterford Streets. Joe's name may also be familiar to you from the Munster Express, where he wrote a column for 14 years. And I would now like to invite Joe to present his lecture, Waterford Streets, a tribute to the late Danny Dowling. Thank you.
Okay, Breda, Mr. Garmagod, agus Guiacas Moore as on Quirisha kind Eigse Slivro Fahan in a most agus in an or the Donald or Dowling, the great Danny Dowling. When Catherine contacted me, would I like to give a talk on some local Waterford Kilkenny national issue, it took me very little time to get back to her and saying, considering it's Eigse Livru, there's only one subject I want to talk about, and that is in tribute to Danny Dowling, who taught me, for a Kilkenny man to a Cork man, who taught me so much about the city that we shared of Waterford. So to get across by way of introduction, what brought me here this evening and my respect for Danny, I just have a piece to read before I start on my series of images and maps along the streets that Dan spoke so informed about, and I learned so much and used in my columns. What gave me a particular pleasure when I visited him with Martin Gann was I said, thank you for your use of your knowledge when I, in some of my columns for the Munster Express. I was very pleased, and he said, oh, I read them all, and in fairness to you, you always gave me credit. So I was pleased and honored by that. So by way of introduction, before I go on to my talk proper, say how I got to this point. On the 17th of March in 21, Martin Gann, having contacted me because he knew of my interest and respect, I posted the following in the history site, and the News and Star, in fact, used what I wrote by way of their tribute in the paper. So I said in that, to get going, sad to relate the news of the passing last evening of Danny Dowling of Glenmore, a much esteemed local historian, not just of his home place in South Kilkenny, but also his highly regarded 98 work of Waterford Streets, past and present, which will endure as a valuable legacy. Danny celebrated his 94th birthday just over a month ago, and until very recently was responding willingly as ever to local queries of the curious as to various aspects of history. Waterford Streets was my favorite and much treasured and well-thumbed Waterford history book. It proved a valuable ongoing resource, which I used as the key reference when penning my column for Views of the Brass Cock, when dealing with aspects of Waterford history, especially of its highways and byways, its streets and squares, and so much more. It all spurred me to go on my own journeys into the rich and varied tapestry of Waterford history. I had the pleasure to visit Danny at his book-filled home in Glenmore a few years back, courtesy of our mutual friend Martin Gann and of course Pat. By way of humble tribute to Danny, I reproduced for that day one of my favorite street columns, that of Stephen Street. Guided as ever by Danny's keen knowledge, I entitled that article Streetwise Stephen Street. And I concluded, Gur raibh maith agat Danny agus suimne sirí dud anam úsal. So on to the great book itself. Danny's excellent 12-page introductory chapter to the city's history before he begins on the streets begins thus with this opener. The story of Waterford's historic streets is a story that is old as the city itself. It is linked both in time and space through the evolutionary process that has witnessed the transformation of an early 10th century Viking Longford into a modern cosmopolitan city. Continuing, this is a story that over 1,000 years old and one that is constantly unfolding as the city grows. Now, my focus this evening, because it's such a huge sweep, I decided to focus on when the walls came down and Waterford began to expand beyond those walls. Dan had told us in great interesting detail about what was inside the walls. He now also told us the highways and byways that led from the ancient city. I live on the eastern side of the city, so I'm going to focus on that. So our focus this evening is at a crucial stage of that unfolding. I love that word unfolding that he used, of the city, when the city's ancient defensive walls began to come tumbling down in more senses than one. My subtitle for this, Suburbia Intacta, because that's where we're heading. So we move on, as I said, a series of slides, and I'll talk to each and try and bring you on a journey, beginning with a map of what the city looked like in 1695 on the brink of the 18th century. There, of course, is Dan and my much loved and many people's much loved book. So here we go to our first image. This is 1695. And what's interesting about it, this was done where the citadel was built. Richard Christmas was mayor. John Mason followed him. And both of them at that side, with the Williamite Wars over, they said, we want to open up the city and invite people to be part of it. It was a new beginning. And I give this talk on the eve of, finally, I think, the North Quay is going to happen, which in our era is going to be as transformative as the era of the walls coming down, which Dan told us about in his excellent section on the quay in the book. So here we have this early map. This here, if my light is working, it doesn't matter. You would see there that you have Brednell's Tower, and where the Mall is now. Oh yeah, I have it. Where the Mall is now that was water, where the Vikings first came in with their longboats. All this was marsh. In fact, it was land that was donated after the suppression of Greyfriars, granted by Henry VIII. Normally, you endowed land to support an abbey or a hospital, which he did. So all that land was subsequently developed, and is, until very recent times, continued to be in the ownership of the Holy Ghost Trust, which originally was in Greyfriars and now is out the Cork Road. Here we have the pill. As I said, the citadel. This was drawn up as the Phillips map. So that's our starting point, and this is where the work began, and the mall began to be built some years later. So now we go on. This is an 1846 map. Now a lot was happening in the 05 when the walls, the key walls began to come down. In the 30s, they began to lay out the mall. Here on the old hospital donated lands, Holy Ghost, they established a bowling green, seen in a lot of the early maps. Here you have Lombard Street, and here, just about see it, is Lombard Street Bridge, which was built in 1726. Now, prior to this, the only egress to the coast was through John's Bridge. That was there from various time with a bastion, just like there was the citadel at St. Patrick's Gate. They were the two main ways out of the city. Other gates evolved. So in 1726, with the building of this bridge by Congreve. Now, who the developers of this area here later was the Penrose family. Now, the Quakers did a lot of the development of the mall, as they did in my native Cork. Were responsible for reclaiming land around Washington Street, the courthouse, an area called the Marsh. And all this was a marsh, and they did the same thing here, especially the Penrose family. We will mention them again. They were cousins of the Waterford Crystal, Penrose's first cousin. So the big breakthrough was leading from here was the Lombard Street Bridge, initially a wooden bridge and later replaced by the stone bridge that we see today. And they still had to work their way through a marsh and development. And that increasingly happened over the subsequent decades and indeed centuries. And they're still building out the road. But it began with the crossing of the Pill at this point. The old cathedral was still there. The new cathedral wasn't built yet. That was built in 1779, and some people decried the demolition of the old thing. To the newly prosperous citizens of Waterford, and increasing during the 18th century, they wanted to show their success. This was neoclassical architecture. To them, this represented prosperity. This represented a new age. So this was the beginning of things. This is a 60-40 map. I said there was a bowling green originally developed there. The previous bowling green was over by the manor where the Quakers had their first meeting house. And that's just to give a bit of atmosphere of what was on that site until the end of that century when it was developed. We move on. Now we go to the Quays itself, the famous painting. Now, a crucial year was 1705. In 1705, David Lewis of Welsh extraction, Waterford prospered by so many people coming here, apart from the Kilkenny and the Corkmen. People came from Belgium, from France, and so on. Bill Irish said, I had a note there earlier, in his great book on shipping, he said, and it was at this age, he said, the game changer for Waterford was the arrival of the Quakers, who came about 1660. They became the great merchants. And the Huguenots in about 1690, 95, the time of the map that we originally saw. Christmas, he and Christmas and Mason sent out a call to merchants of other countries. We're open for business. Even though it was the beginning of the imposition of penal laws, Waterford decided, and acts of anti-propriety and all that bad stuff, they said, we're open for business. You're welcome. We will give freedom of the city, meaning voting rights, trading rights, no penal taxes, but come to our city and build it up. So that's what subsequently happened. People came, traded. Some of the merchants that had fled earlier in the early 17th century with the constant wars began to return, and the key. Now, the most interesting thing about this famous Van Hagen painting, which was done in 36, a lot of the stuff was happening, is that all the buildings are facing the quay. Now, they took down the walls. Each was, this was the main, from Reginald's Tower up as far as the clock tower. That was the original quay. And originally opposite Barron Strand Street. There was no clock tower then. And it was this section of the quay. And it was under Lewis and subsequent mayors and generations that what they called the new quay, which was called Merchant Quay for obvious reasons, extended further down. But this was where, now, is that they faced. The same thing happened in Dublin. I was reading there a couple of months ago. The Duke of Ormond, the Ormond's Quay, there were Four Courts are and Jervis. So these were developers in Dublin around the same time, created the quays. They didn't exist, right? Nor did we have the thoroughfare that you see now. The walls came down. There was gates to the particular sections of the quay that was owned by the right holders, and the walls were crumbling anyway, and they got permission. They said, look, can we take things down? We want to grow. As I said, the city was opening up because there had been, because of the Williamite Wars, and before that, again, there was a siege mentality, and walls were there for protection. They no longer became necessary. Said their credo was, we're open for business, regardless of nationality or creed. They were businessmen. We welcome businessmen. And that took a change of attitude, and it changed Waterford. So you will see the toll still here, and this was the exchange, which was built in 1715, and the custom house alongside of it. When this famous painting was taken in 36, this was like a shop front. This was like the IDA wanting their city to be portrayed, a photograph, a brochure, saying this is the new face. And Danny, in his book, quotes many descriptions of the quay, the most noblest quay in Waterford, but he has lots more. I was impressed. There was 10, 12 and more of people who say, wow, this is, what an amazing quay. I can't resist telling what Noel Kelly used to teach in the Central Tech. I remember saying, yes, he said this about 30 years ago to me. He said, it may well have been the noblest quay in Europe, but now it's the noblest car park in Europe. I enjoyed the humor. So while this was being taken down to the side, the Mall was developing, and they were breaking into the suburbs, crossing that bridge I showed you, Lombard Street Bridge. We'll talk about the Lombards in a moment, but equally from Barron Strand Street and the new quay, running parallel to the new quay. And then Danny tells us in great detail about the emergence. Georgia Street went as far as T&H's. Mainly the Quakers, but others as well. It wasn't a Quaker town, but there were a sizable portion of the merchants. Over that century, what was then King Street, Queen Street, began to emerge with many of their businesses, where business cheek by jowl with their residents. So the building of the bridges, the moving of prosperity, the crowding, teeming city, because it was beginning to thrive with the Newfoundland trade, began to get overcrowded, and the merchants now wanting to move because things were opening up and they had the confidence to move out, and they began to move to the suburbs, be it up John's Hill, or now it was possible to cross Lumber Street Bridge, and they began to edge their way out over the course of the next century, 2 centuries indeed, even me in Knockboy in 1973, and the city began to grow. And Danny maps every step of the way. Now, I spent longer on this, but I think it's worthwhile. It's when everything changed. Now, I like this photograph because it gives a close-up of painting in 1778. Things were thriving, and the toll cell here, which was switched later to the Mall. This fell into ruin about 1780. We move on. Now, the Mall began to be laid out. I'm moving ahead. This is an early 19th century famous painting. The original is in the museum in Waterford Treasures, but it shows that progress has been made. The Bishop Foy Palace, the Bishop Palace in 1783 is a big year in the evolution of Waterford. Waterford Crystal, the same time. And other stuff I quote you about 1700. What happened in 1783, 82? Grattan's Parliament, taxation laws, excise duties, all these things that were inhibiting trade, all of a sudden were taken away, and we could trade on an equal footing. Often we were provisioning, that the provision trades was huge. And the provisioning came from South Kilkenny, South Tipperary, County Waterford. But they could now trade on equal terms. We used to provision the Bristol ships, and then Waterford merchants began to build their own ships and began to trade. And Waterford took off continuously, and they wanted to show their wealth by developing the Mall here. Now, some of the images to the right there of ourselves block off down at the end of the Mall with the Delphi building where the Imperial was later is our picture. So I have a picture of that coming up. So here, jumping a century ahead, this was a Victorian makeover to the Georgian front of what is now the Tower Hotel. This was Murray's Imperial, about 1890, but it had a more Georgian, it was built around 1792, part of that. And this developed into offices for the Waterford Steamship Company, with the Malcolmsons owned later. And beside that, many of you have seen the photographs, the Adelphi Hotel called after. Down around the corner, you had a Delphi Terrace. Now, all this was developed on what originally had been that site donated, granted by Henry VIII, the Holy Ghost, and they derived rental income there to support the charitable work. Now, what also attracted me about this photograph is that we're going to be going down Lombard Street, and as Pat knows better than me, at the other corner of that street, the housing office used to be there. So if I click on, now I just put in this, despite the walls coming down, it took almost another century, 1793, before Waterford managed to build a bridge at the assistance, and stayed a toll bridge, much to the annoyance of the citizens and the merchants, until 1907. But it's interesting that I remember reading in one of Jack Burchell's great articles about South Kilkenny, that it's not a coincidence that the villages such as Glenmore, Slieveroo, following the main roads, and Mullinavat began to grow at the same time, because they were the centres of, there was no cornfields and piggeries in Waterford. This is where the corn and the wheat was grown and the produce that they brought to market. And they had to go over this bridge or over in the ferry. So the prosperity of one was tied in with the with the other when the bridge was finally built. We go on now. Our journey to the eastern city, to the eastern suburbs, is across Lombard Street Bridge, and I'll mention the Lombards in a moment, who were a remarkable family. This is from the Municipal Art Collection, Michael O'Connell, and I discovered his granddaughter now writes for the Irish Times, Jennifer O'Connell, every Saturday. And he painted this, and it was only last year, when he keeps on learning things, that George's Quay there is around the corner. He was born there and lived there and grew up there, so he had a natural interest in painting this particular scene. So this is the, be it Lombard Street Bridge or Williamsbury, opens up the eastern suburbs of Waterford. William Street, William Scott gave his name to Scott's Quay. Gradually, some industrial, residential, especially at the first half, evolved over the course of the century, particularly from 1750 on. Now, Danny says, this is where Danny says who the street was named after. This is Peter Lombard. Now, it wasn't named after Peter Lombard. It was named after the fact that this open street and bridge was leading to Lombard's Marsh, which was the huge area. Now, there was marshlands all the way over to the west. When I came to Waterford first and a good while afterwards, Coldbury, all that area flooded, and Park Road, because it was all a marsh, and it was resurrecting itself up to modern times. So Danny, in his book, says Lombard Street, as it named, so named as it led to the extensive marshland of that name. He says, the Lombards, a family prominently identified with business and administrative affairs of the city, as well as leading clerics and scholars from the 14th to the 17th century. Now, the most notable being, whom we see, Peter Lombard. He became a Bishop of Armagh. He was never in Armagh, but Shinskillela. But you were given the living of it and the authority. David Rote, Rote House in Kilkenny. He was his man on the ground here in Ossory and in Waterford. He, in fact, was an uncle of Luke Wadding. His mother, Wadding's mother, being a Lombard, whatever. Now, I could spend the evening, all night, in fact, talking when I discovered. This is an example where I read that here and it excited my curiosity. I'd like to hear more about Peter Lombard. And I came across a wonderful article in Daisys 56 and then read other papers. And this man was amazing. I just confined myself to saying from 54 to 1625. This was James I came in, the end of Elizabeth. This was the time of Hugh O'Neill and the wars there. My photograph talks to Galileo. I'll come back to that in a second. He dealt with James I, trying to convince him to adhere to the Catholic faith. But he was realistic when James made his choice. He said, right, that's what we're dealing with. Let's deal with reality. He dealt with Philip of Spain. He led the commission. This is where I used the caption before, when Waterford was at the center of the universe, because he was appointed to head the commission that began to investigate Galileo and ask him to explain himself. why he was running in the face of the Bible. Now, that saga went on for 20 years, another 10 years after Lombard died in 26. But he was the go-to man in Rome, Paul V at that time. 5 popes served, all short-lived, 5 popes served during his tenure. And he was the go-to man. When you got appointed pope, well, what do I do next? Ask Peter Lombard. He'll sort you. So for me, a remarkable person, and probably the most outstanding, most influential Waterford person I've come across, bar none, in terms of influence on a European, if not further afield scale. So every time I see Lombard Street, I think of Peter Lombard, even though the reality is it was the street leading to Lombard's Mart, which they owned, of course. Now we go on to another map, and I decided to use this because it's the 64 map, because it shows the other side of the river. You can see Christendom there, the section that was in Galtier, part of the Liberties of Waterford, the Abbey Church, Ferrybank, and Bracolaheen. You go over here, this is our Bowling Green again, Lombard Street opening up, the quays having been laid out, down Scotch Quay, down William Street. You turned up to Newtown, De La Salle, later, much later almost here, the park developed here. And look here, as early as 1640, there was a sugar house, Waterford's first sugar house. Here there was a Mr. Green, had a salt house. You could not do the provisioning. Waterford was 80% provisions, and salt was the vital commodity for that trade. So salt was king. That's a fabulous map. And the top of the screen there cuts off where it shows Newtown, where I ended up in July 1972. So on we go. We've got through William Street, and this is the lodge. Now, the park was built in 1857, the Gate Lodge itself in 1900. Now, the opening of it was 1957. Central Park in New York began in 1957. The first public park in Britain, Birkenhead Park, was just 10 years earlier. John Aloysius Blake, or I'm sure he was called Jack Blake to his friends, was one of Waterford's most brilliant mayors, and then became maybe a remarkable individual. Another one of my heroes that is rarely spoke about. He was an incredible man. When he was 26, he was instrumental in, he was born in Gladstone Street, he was instrumental in getting Waterford's first art school established upstairs in the new savings bank, courtesy of Joshua Strangman, who did so much during the famine. And it was he as mayor, 29 years of age, drove the whole project of the park. He first raised it in March 1955. They were handing over, had an agricultural show to celebrate its opening by Lord Carlisle, or the Earl of Carlisle, thus the name of the bridge, by 1857. 2.5 years. Amazing. Here at the side, which the photographs cover, they erected the signs there telling who were involved in the opening of the park. We'll say a little bit more. Now, Dermot Power wrote a brilliant, Dermot will be speaking next Tuesday, in Dacia's 52, where I got my original information from, even though I read further on the subject. And it's an incredible asset. And one of the, we'll go on to the two gentlemen involved. This is the mature Blake. He died in 87 of a heart attack suddenly, but had done so much between then with fisheries, concern for mental health, problems to do with the ring, as well as building the Wide Street Commission. He did so much. 29 when he started, older man there, died in London while attending Westminster. This here is the man who was the chairman of the committee, and no better buccal, was Abraham Roberts, the father of Earl Roberts, the grandson of the architect John Roberts. He was in charge of driving the whole project. Maybe that's why it was delivered on time. You had a retired army general driving the project. On we go here now. Now, here's an old map. Some people don't realize you come up here, the road that we spoke about, William Street, Canada Street, which I'll mention shortly, up. Now, here's where here I'm pointing with my finger. I should be using my breathing. Here is where the park was built. Now, this was total marsh. The Pill did a big curve here. Now, that had to be diverted and brought across here. In here was St. Catherine's Abbey. Colbeck Street was here, St. Colbeck's gate. Again, more marsh here. John's Quay, that was an earlier, Angdrub's was an earlier name for what we now call the waterside. So that was here. Again, my first awareness of the development of the park and Jack Blake was in Danny's book, like much of what I have said previously. So I'm celebrating what I learned from him. So on we go. This is a later ordnance survey map of the same site, where somebody is showing with the yellow mark of the old river, but it does show where the bandstand is. So the loop was there. It shows where the fountain is. The bandstand was put in 69, and the fountain was added in 83. Now, it was as I said, the first one, park in what? It was the first to be called the People's Park. It was dubbed by one of the journalists in the Munster Express, who said because it was open to the public. That wasn't true of other parks. There was town parks in other places, but there were private quays. A lot of those were in Dublin and in Limerick, but this from day one was open to the public. So somebody writing in the paper said this is very much the People's Park, and the name stuck. Now, Earl Carlisle, who opened it, and they named the bridge after him, he was also the Viceroy, the Lord Lieutenant, and he also helped to establish and gave it the same name, the People's Garden in the Phoenix Park on the right as you go in the main gate. They show there where Catherine's Abbey was. Now, one thing before I move on from it is that the park was a marsh. It had to be filled with something, and its foundation is very interesting, and it kind of ties in with Danny's work and also what Blake did. In what we call Broad Street, and the top of what is now John Roberts Square, there was a whole labyrinth of lanes: Garter Lane, Little Baron Strand Street, Oak Tavern Street, and others. And there was the Broad Street Commission driven by our friend, Mr. Blake. And so it was a twin thing. One was to rid the town of these unhygienic, unsanitary buildings, cramped, congested buildings, which was not good for public health. And then at the same time, no need to destroy all these. And that's why he said we must have a public park, because the people, there was an awareness of the importance of fresh air and sanitation for public health, a growing awareness in the 19th century. And that's why he drove, at the other side of the coin, to ridding the streets of, at that stage of its slums. There was more slums later on, but that was his project, and he drove that. As I said, he was an exceptional man. Now, I gave you a little preview there. Some of my favorite photographs, images from that Victorian era, to finish up on the park. This is about 1890. You see the fountain and you see the bandstand there. People obviously posing for Mr. Poole or one of theirs, but it's a delightful image. And the People's Park, for literally the people. This is another one, catching the apple of the bridge and the gathering place in Victorian times. I had put down the caption to remind me, because I was going to say it at that stage, Baron Strand Street, Broad Street. Why is that the caption? I have just explained that they formed. What also was used as infill was the dredgings from the river were piled in here. So then the final, I think the final clip to do with the park, but it was worth the time, is that the golf track, cycle track was there. Now there's a connection with the Ferrybank side of here. The Hazard family, the man with the first car, Sir William Goff, funded the track after his name. His brother-in-law, he married a Hazard, a Dobbin Hazard of Sir Francis of that name from Rockingham House. And he died young. He became, in the early days of cycling, became champion All-Ireland cyclist, the first probably. And England. And he drowned as a young man, buried over in the Abbey graveyard. And I would say William Goff donated this track in his honor, even though it was known since subsequently as the Goff track. He put a lot of money into it and built a pavilion and things like that. And that's what the park looked after its revamping 2007. So we now move on. Our next topic, we move away from the park. There's a mention here of the shipyard, a brief mention, and a brief mention of why Canada Street is called Canada Street, and graves with their connections with New Ross and Ferrybank. And then, if time permits, we will deal with the cluster of schools that were here that began to emerge in the 19th century in Waterford. If time doesn't permit, we can save that to another day. But I'll have a quick visit to, and it can be quick. Bill Shipsey has done a remarkable work on a brief word about the Malcolmsons. Here is what people have seldom seen, was the daddy of it all, David Malcolm, who came down from Lurgan, worked for Grubbs in Clonmel with corn, came to the Port Law, bought the Powell Drew mills off the Wises of Newtown and the Manor St. John, and he saw the change coming with corn prices and went into cotton. With cotton, and shipping it, and became such a success. They chartered a lot of ships and then said, look, typical Quakers, and said, why are we paying money for all these ships? Why not build our own? So the Neptune Works began initially as a repair shop and evolved into one of the biggest shipyard building yards in Ireland, building some of the biggest ships that were ever built in Ireland. This was his son, Joseph. He was the main man in developing Neptune thing. He was succeeded by William later. 1790, we see there he died in 44. Joseph died relatively young, 98, 60 years of age in 1958. There was a bit of crisis of confidence there because, as they say in Waterford, he was the whole man. So these are just an example of two of their ships, not their biggest. The Sella, for a big boat here. Their biggest was one of their biggest was the Neptune in 46. Originally 172 feet long, extended to 204. It was colossal. Its brow was over the water in Canada Street, while its stern was nearly on top of the park. The park was a godsend to them because it was built during the thriving years, and Joseph Malcolmson donated handsomely to the development of the park. Sure, why wouldn't he? It was a great place for his workforce to relax. So we swiftly go on to end our Malcolmson phase and its major story. 2 points of interest here. The Maritana, we have Maritana Gate and the opera and all that kind of stuff, was the last significant boat built by the yard, which closed in 1802. I call it Swan Song because it looks like a swan. Over here, we have another look at the Delphi buildings over there, the tower which Thomas Francis Meagher famously described as the stone hinge, with its connecting its two wings of the Mall and the Quays. And down from me further here, you had a Delphi terrace where Thomas Wise and Letitia Bonaparte lived when they returned to Ireland from Italy. But that's another scale which I can tell in another time. So that's our quick visit there. Now we move on. This is a great photograph. Graves beginning in New Ross, as you know, and the Dumbrody ship, and they moved to Waterford. Now, some of them had been active in Waterford trading earlier than that in 1850, and Graves finally closed in 85. But this is a great photograph of the riverside, not the street side, of their timber yard and the boats unloading. I've another coming there, and the James Palmer Graves, whom we mentioned again, was the main man in Waterford during that era. He lived in Newtown afterwards. This is another great photograph of the ship here and the timber being loaded. And most of their timber came from Canada, and they traded with Canada. And on the return journey, apart from other cargo they might bring from Waterford, like the Dumbrody in New Ross, their ships advertised as the new Canadian government were madly looking for people to come and settle in the new lands of whatever, they were opening Canada. And so Watson and Graves they were the partners, used to advertise for people to go and settle in Canada, as many of them did. Already many thousands went from Kilkenny and Waterford and Wexford, etc., to Newfoundland, but they wanted people to come to Upper Canada and other places. Upper Canada, we go on, is interesting because for about 6 years, one of the governors of Upper Canada was it was a Colonel Jasper Grant who had married one of the ushers. Well, whatever here. These were the grants of Kilmurray and of grants down further out the Jummo Road. And grants like the Waddings and all these families were very early English, early English, New English, Old English, should I say, in Waterford, and they're a long time. So these were the kind of ads that were appearing in the Waterford News, the Munster Express, and the other papers, looking for people to settle. And so graves were involved in they're looking for sturdy, healthy young men and women to go out. Now, I go on to the education section. Now, this will take about 10 minutes. I could wind up there, or I could just quickly do the schools bit. Okay. I quote Shakespeare's poem there, because the first school opened in Stephen Street around the time that he wrote this, or the predecessor of the Stephen Street School in Lady Lane, which then moved to Stephen Street. And he talks about the reluctant, whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face, creeping like a snail unwillingly to school. So said Shakespeare in the 7 Ages of Man. Now I'll make a quick detour to just a couple of words to Stephen Street, Troy Stefan, and which I reproduced back in March. One of my favorite Danny streets that he describes, and then I wrote about. And it was, for what is now an insignificant street, it was remarkable, and it was the centre of schools in Waterford. So I want to have a quick look at that, because it has a direct bearing on the founding of Water Park and De La Salle and St. Declan's. The story begins in Stephen Street, that Danny so described, and where I got all my information from. So we'll quickly go on, and I'll try and round it up. This is the Catholic University School. There, that's again, I'm pointing. That's Bachelor's Walk up the side, the front of Stephen Street here. And this was opened in 62. Now, it had been a corporation, Protestant grammar school since 1793, which previously had been, since Shakespeare's time, been in Lady Lane. It became a Catholic University School in 62 until 86. In 1950, the Irish hierarchy were looking for a Catholic university, and they had this idea from the Synod of Thurles in 1850 that they would set up a whole chain of Catholic schools, secondary schools around the country, and they would be feeder schools for the new Catholic university. Now, only 3 were built. This one, St. Flannan's of Ennis. I remember the North Man and Cork used to play lots of matches against St. Flannan's, as I'm sure De La Salle did, and Mount Sion. And St. Flannan's and the Catholic University in Leeson Street in Dublin. This lasted until 86, when it was closed. Bishop. Now, the likes of Canon Power went to school here, and many others, middle-class Catholic students. This was the emerging area of the educated middle-class Catholic, and you had to provide the education for them if you wanted them to take over leadership of the new nationalist Ireland that they were fighting for. So these were crucial places. So that's where it started here. And again, there's great details, further details in Danny's book. So that led on to Water Park and De La Salle and the training college. So we quickly go to Water Park. Now, when this That was the building in 1939. After John Herron's time, the Constitution architect and all that, even Mario Rosenthal went to school, and many other distinguished people, but they themselves talk with pride of John J. Hearn, the first, who introduced the tradition, among lots of other things, of presenting the President of America with a bowl of shamrock. Began with a Waterford man, ex-Water Park boy, who lived and was born in William Street that we passed through earlier. Now, this was the original house. I bought this image from the National Library. And this is when the brothers had it, but this was this was James Palmer Graves's house. Now, when the Ursuline nuns came in 16, they were here for a couple of years, their numbers grew, it was a smaller house, and then they moved over to where they still are in Ballytruckle. In 92, James Graves moved to Upper Newtown, just before you get to the junction with the Passage Road, Rockville at the corner. The house just before that is where he lived and died, and the brothers take over. There's another lovely image coming up. This was 1913, and this is some of the pupils talking at the school gates. And you can see the park wall opposite. Another little bit of trivia I meant to mention about the park is that the wall that surrounds the park, still the same wall, it was always public, came from Bilberry, much of the stone. But a lovely 1913 image of this emerging suburb of Waterford. And then, of course, we've been talking about schools and we didn't show any pupils. So that's an early picture, about 1910, of pupils at Water Park College. On we go. Now, this is an early photograph of the De La Salle, but the interesting thing, the narrower road, which was widened later, is the original Newtown House. There's often confusion. Newtown House here, where the brothers originally opened their school. Up at the top left corner was Newtown Lodge, and Newtown, where the Wises were, and the Wises were, and later the Quaker school, which I spent so many happy years, was simply known as Newtown. And I naively, when I came first, I thought it was called Newtown because they were the first to open a town here. The townland up there was called Newtown since the 1500s. It's like New Street in town. New Street in town was built in about 1580. So don't be misled by the term new. So there is where they started. And in 91, 92, they got permission to build here, and they built this great thing. They went from there until, unfortunately, and I'm sweeping through a massive amount of history. Fergus Dunn has just written a great history. Until 39, where they pleaded with the government to keep it open as a training college. They continued to train their own brothers, and then it finally closed in 49, but they reopened as a secondary school. At this side of the road, opposite the side gate, was St. Patrick. In 1935, they opened a secondary school, and the pupils then went between the two, and that became the main secondary school. But a fascinating thing I only found out last week, involving the other side of the river. Before the brothers finally bought this, now, one of the reasons they came to Waterford was the success, and I forgot to mention it. We were looking at the university alongside of it, saying Stevens opened in 1887 and blossomed and bloomed. The people used to call it the French Brothers and so on. And it was such a success that the De La Salle, who had just arrived in Ireland a couple of years earlier, were based in Castletown and Laois, were looking for a teacher training college to start one. And they came to Waterford because of the success. Because if you had to teach in a college, you need a big, successful training school, primary school, so that they could do their teaching practice. So they said, and they got the permission of the bishop and first bought that and they built their school. But where they also looked at, and that was fascinating to learn this, was Sign Hill House. After the Powers had it. And because an important feature back then was that part of the curriculum was going to be horticultural science, teaching farming methods. And they, in fact, they didn't go for it in that they thought it would be too inaccessible from the city and things like that. Even though that didn't matter, with a residential training college, be out in the country, especially on the beautiful Kilkenny South, with a lovely view of the river, and so on. But they thought this was more convenient. And so they plumbed for this and built the school, and a great history there that would take another talk and a half to tell about. But where they did buy the following year, back in 98, was in Williamstown in Bishop's Court, and they bought a 51-acre farm there for the teaching of horticultural science, because many of their teacher trainees would be in rural communities like Glenmore and Mullinavat and Sliabru, and would be a part in that they knew their cows and their donkeys and their turnips and their wheat, etc. So that's a bit of character there, and we're almost finished. That's just an old image of the same school there rather than the modern one. And it's before the statue was there and some further work, just a bit of atmosphere. Another favorite, Robert Burke, who was an artist for many years in the Central Tech, and he was one of the founders of the Municipal Art Collection and the Art School in Waterford, highly respected teacher. He did a whole series of Waterford scenes. I have most of them, and I had one of De La Salle that he did in about 1946, and I thought I would include it. I don't think this has been online before. It certainly was. I got it from a journal, photographed it. So that's as I looked in the modern era, as was in 49, the government didn't go for it, but became a successful secondary school. Now, just go on to schools, because I've only 3 more slides. This is Newtown Lodge. Now, the brothers were in the house, the original house. They got that from the Hobsons, whatever. The Hobsons that were, there's a plaque up in the Tower Hotel wall saying the first governor of New Zealand and Hobson Bay by Melbourne in Australia and all that kind of stuff. Some other book I read recently and said he was actually born in Newtown Lodge. You know where the solicitor's office are now, Northern Farley and Cobb. Now, this family here are the what's the old name of Shaw's? Robertson. I was just miserable moment. This is the Robertson family that were part of that company that owned that original shop there, and standing for a family photograph. There is because it ties in with De La Salle, there's the St. Benilde's. Again, I was always curious about place names and names of people, and where did that name came from. Cousins of mine actually built this church from Cork. This is Pierre Romancon. He was the first, and I think only, De La Salle saint. Now, why is he relevant? He was back in the 18th century, 19th century. He was canonized in 1967. The brothers gave the site here for the new church to the expanding suburb. We're expanding, which we're going to talk, and they opened the Folly also built by the Falveys, and opened this church here to cater for the growing suburbs of the city. So the local bishop, in honor of the De La Salle order, named it after the recently canonized Saint Benedictus. And finally, and we'll stop while there's one more after this. This is the 1770-ish Wise family home, which they bought. William Penrose, who with his brother Richard developed that Mal area, that Adelphi Key area. William leased this from the Wises from 91, and the Quakers then bought it, and he bought a house just up the road from Newtown. And finally, my very last image, just to give finish with a family photograph. This is a family photograph of the family who built Newtown. Francis, Mary, Marianne, whose uncle was from Bailey New Street, and John Wise, who was the father of Tom, who was the father of Sir Tom and all that kind of stuff. And he was the son of the famous Bullock Wise. So this was there, and it shows their lavish lifestyle. When the Quakers bought the building, they took out all the ornate thing because they believed in plain living and no fancy decor. It wouldn't suit a school anyway. But this was done for a family portrait for the Wise family. I arrived at the gates of Newtown, as I said, in July 72. While I was waiting for my interview, I sat, and it was a beautiful sunny day, and I sat in the park. Little did I realize that nearly 70, it feels like 70, 50 years later, I would be here talking about that road that I walked up for the first time on the 15th of July, 1972. And in final comment, I say, Gurrav Mila Mila Mahagod to Danny Dowling, who taught me a lot of what I know and continue to learn about Cahir Fortlauriga. Shine Machind, Gurrav Mila Mahagod.
Joe, thank you very, very much for that. That was absolutely fantastic. Just if anybody has any question, would you just drop it into the chat box, please, and we'll come to it. Or if you're stuck, maybe just give us a wave. We might be able to do it that way with the video.
Yeah.
Can I just? I mean, that was absolutely fabulous. You brought us from the Vikings right up to the present day, and I have to say the photographs were fantastic. That Robert.
Yes, I thought it was a good way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. The quality of that Robertson family photograph is really exceptional.
Yes, amazing.
Yeah, it's really incredible. Can I just ask you? You mentioned the grammar schools. Other than you said Danny had spoken about it in the book. Other than that, is there much written on those schools?
I did come across, because I read the whole time, like many of you. A Michael Quain. He was a senior researcher with the National Museum, and he was part of the Thomond Historical Society. Died about 30 years ago. He did a whole fabulous series to whom I owe a lot of my information about schools. He wrote about all the emergent and all the different schools in the country, especially ones that were off centre or slightly different or forgotten about. And he wrote about most of the grammar schools, be it Donegal or be it Kilkenny, be it Waterford. He has an in-depth article about what was known as the Corporation School, because it was granted by them. The Corporation took away their funding in 1860 in Waterford, and therefore the Bishop O'Brien saw his chance and moved in. So he wrote a lot on the subject. But the first one, it's interesting that Bishop Foy, when he founded Foy School, or less a big bequest for it in 1707, he found it necessary to found the school because it didn't all start with Edmund Rice, even though he made a huge difference. He founded his school 100 years earlier, is because too many of his children, young boys, girls, of the Protestant community were beginning to attend the Catholic schoolmasters. So he thought he'd open a school. And the big thing, these were charity schools, and they used to be known as blue schools. A blue school, they now kind of became a kind of a posh thing later, but blue school meant a charity school, which was funded by the corporation, where there was no fees. And one of the big things there, and Brother Rice did it at the beginning as well, was that you were given an education free and fed, as Brother Rice did, but the main objective, because remember, you were coming from the poorer families, because wealth families you educated, which are governors and governesses and all that kind of stuff. They gave you an apprenticeship. They prepared you for an apprenticeship. So it was very skills orientated, which was kind of doing your sums and writing for keeping ledgers, as well as doing manual work. And on leaving, the key thing, on leaving, I can still be heard, yeah. On leaving, you were given your apprenticeship fee. So you could go along to your new master with your £10, which the school gave you. So that was your ticket to the future. And you gave that to the master because you couldn't be educated free or your apprenticeship free. And once you had an apprenticeship, you were entitled then to join a guild and entitled to become a free man of the city. It was your ticket out of humble origins. And Foy started the school to win back their pupils. But there is stuff on there. That Michael Quain, if you Google him, has written a phenomenal amount of such schools.
Great, thank you very much. Now your last chance to drop a question in the chat box, just while I run through the remainder of our program. Thanks to everybody. We've had a great turnout tonight. Thanks to everybody for joining us. So we'll be back again on Tuesday, which is the 16th. Our speaker is Mr. Dermot Power, and the topic is the removal of orphans from the workhouses. And then on Thursday, again at 8 o'clock here on Zoom, Mr. John O'Halloran will speak on his experiences from Pilltown to the Congo and back. So sure, all to be fascinating. The room ID and the password, which you've all obviously managed to conquer, those will remain the same for those two lectures as well. And they're both at 8 o'clock as well. So listen, thanks to everybody for your participation and for being with us. There's some lovely comments there coming in the box. I don't see any more questions. So with that, Robin, are we able to unmute everybody? We'll have a round of applause in a second if we can do that.
I didn't catch that. Could you try again?
No.
That wasn't me.
Poor old Siri is
Yeah,
checking in. Well, anyway, we'll give the round of applause anyway and we'll finish up. So thanks very much to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you very much, Pat. Thanks a million, Joe. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome.